Hi, guys, and welcome to the second online lecture that we have for this week. So this week we're going to continue to talk about civil society and social capital, but we're going to shift focus from the traditional civil society groups that we were talking about last class into a new category of what we call uncivil society groups, which I'll define for you a little bit later. But before we get started, let's go through a little housekeeping. So again, remember that I said that your midterm grades have all been returned. So if you haven't gotten your midterm grade, that means that there's something wrong in the system. So you need to either email me or email your assigned TA so we can figure out what's going on with your midterm grade and make sure that we get your exam graded and your grade back to you. Beyond that, of course, we've shifted to remote instruction, as you already know. And I put a number of resources online for you guys to help you as we get into this remote instruction. So the online guide is posted up on Sakai. If you're watching this video, that means you've already gotten the link to our YouTube, and you can ask questions to us via Slack if you have any questions about the lectures or what's going on in class, the assignments, etc. Slack is a great place to do that. All the links to those are provided in the online guide and in last week's lecture. So if you want those links, just pause this video and go to either the last video or download that online guide, which is a good FAQ for how this class is going to be run moving forward. So now to get into things, so just to recap what we did last class. Last class, we looked at civil society and democracy and the relationship between the two, and we determined that civil society was important for us to look at for three main reasons. So one of which is that civil society helps to aggregate interests of citizens upward to the state. So civil society organizations can serve as advocacy organizations, that help us to basically transmit our preferences more effectively to our representatives in politics. It can also serve as a check on the state. So when the state is acting in ways that is against the interests of citizens, civil society, again, can act as those advocacy groups that make sure that the state is acting as it's supposed to, right? They can place pressure upon the state to choose different policies or to behave in a different way. And therefore, they maintain a balance of power between citizens and the state. They help to do that. But one of the biggest things that we talked about is how civil society groups can serve as what we call schools of democracy. Not only do they socialize citizens to engage with one another in more civic and tolerant ways, right? They're a way for people to interact with others, get to know other people, discuss with others, and become open to new opinions. But they are also a way to practice democratic skills. So you can practice community organizing, you can practice voting, you can become more informed about politics, and all those things translate very easily into the types of political behaviors like voting, petitioning, political engagement that we think are very important for democracy. And we saw this very clearly in the case of Italy, right? So we looked at civil society, the relationship between civil society and democracy in Italy. And what we saw is that institutional strength tends to be correlated with the strength of civil society. So where civil society, where the civic community is high, when there are tons of organizations and people get together and social capital is high, where people trust one another, then we often see that institutions tend to perform better in the case of Italy. And that is the central argument of Bob Putnam's book, Making Democracy Work. But at the end of the class, I posed a question to you, which is that how does this relationship change, or how might it be altered when civil society groups don't hold liberal values? The types of groups that Putnam is talking about are, basically groups with liberal political values: bowling leagues, soccer teams, women's groups, things like this, things that we think have positive value orientation. But again, civil society groups are just associations that are organized, not involved in the state, and are kind of outside of this triangle that we saw of the family, the market, and the state. So that means that hate groups might also be classified as civil society groups. Groups that are exclusive of certain communities might also be classified as civil society groups. And is there a reason why we should think that those types of groups are going to be productive for democracy, right? That they're going to generate the types of positive behaviors that we think translates into democracy. So at the end of last class, I asked you to consider a couple of questions and write down your answers to them. And now we're going to place the central focus on these types of groups and try to figure out what is the relationship between uncivil society and democracy, and how might civil society be co-opted or used towards non-democratic ends. So the guiding questions that we're going to deal with today are: one, what is uncivil society? How might the rise of uncivil society affect the strength of democracy? And how should civil society be structured to create positive outcomes for democracy? So if we know that certain civil society groups or certain types of groups negatively affect the strength of democracy, how might we orient those groups differently to create the positive outcomes that we want? So, to the first question, what is uncivil society? Well, remember that civil society was the sphere of organized non governmental and non-violent associations that exist outside of the state, market, and the family. So, you'll recall that picture of the triangle that I had, where there's the state on top, the family, and the market on the bottom. And civil society is everything kind of inside of that that doesn't quite touch those three borders. So, we're talking about NGOs, PTA groups, unions, possibly business associations, but not the businesses themselves, etc. But uncivil society is a specific set of associations within civil society that either they challenge these liberal democratic views that we assume civil society groups have by promoting exclusive ideologies, predatory practices, or some type of violent behavior. So where we can think of a civil society group as being something relatively peaceful, for example, Greenpeace, we might think of an uncivil society group being something like the Ku Klux Klan, right? They are clearly exclusivist in their ideology, in the fact that they obviously exclude people of color and minorities. They promote illiberal values oriented towards hatred and discrimination. And on occasion, on more than one occasion, they use violence to promote their agenda. So this is kind of a classic uncivil society group. And what we're seeing, at least in the United States context, is that hate groups, these types of uncivil society groups, are actually growing. So hate groups is classified by the Southern Law Poverty Center, have been increasing over the course of the past 2 decades, with a slight dip around 2014, but have reached a peak this year of about 10,000 1,000 different hate groups. I think it's 1,020 that exist in the United States today. And the rise of these hate groups has been correlated with a lot of things that we think is unsafe for American democracy. So we all know that there's been an increasing trend of polarization in American democracy. There's also been an increasing trend of hate crimes and violence, as we have seen the growth of these hate groups. And so all of this seems to bode very negatively for at least American democracy. And we might think that there is an inherent negative relationship between the growth of these uncivil, illiberal groups and democracy, simply because these groups do contribute to things like polarization between different groups in society, which tends to kind of hollow out the middle of the political spectrum and make politics much more extreme. So that's difficult for democracy. It increases violence, and we all know that conflict and violence is often not very productive of democracy. So in general, we tend to think of uncivil society groups being negatively related to democracy, and these more traditional civil society groups perhaps having that positive relationship. But it's interesting to look at how the rise of uncivil and civil society groups might affect the strength of democracy. And one place where we've seen this in class through your reading is the case of Weimar Germany. So Weimar Germany is kind of an exceptional case in that it was a very kind of robust democratic experiment in Germany that happened right after World War I. So from the 1920s to about the 1930s. So here, this is Germany's big democratic experiment. We get a new constitution. We get new institutions in the form of the Reichstag. And we're seeing kind of the proliferation of democratic life. There are parties now in Germany. There are democratic elections that happen every 2 or so years. And what we also see kind of coincident with the rise of these new democratic institutions is the flourishing of civil society. So this bodes kind of positively for the relationship, again, between democracy and civil society. As we see the opening of German politics under the Weimar Republic, we also see the opening of German civil society, where more people are gathering together in individual groups, bowling leagues, casual clubs, salons, etc., to kind of meet with one another, to discuss politics, to do kind of all of these things that we think are very productive for democracy. However, as Sherry Berman notes in her article, the one that you read, it actually doesn't seem to translate to a more robust democracy in Germany. Even though we have the right political institutions and civil society is flourishing, what we don't see is a coincident like translation of those skills learned in civil society into actual behavior in the political arena. So when we look at voting in Weimar Germany, we see is that parties don't actually tend to be all that popular, right? So we're not seeing people use the skills that they get in these civil society groups to go out and vote for political parties. In fact, the political party system is quite fragmented and quite, I wouldn't say unpopular, but definitely not as popular, not as robust as we think. So outside of the main the main party in Germany, which is the Social Democratic Party, we see is that all of the rest of the top 10 parties, none of them get more than 15% of the vote. And so we have not only a very fragmented party system, but a kind of inchoate and hollow party system in which citizens don't seem to be really affiliating very strongly with parties. And according to Berman, this shows how there's not a necessarily one-to-one relationship between the growth of civil society and the strength of democracy in any country. In fact, the growth of civil society may be due, in the case of Weimar Germany, to the weakness of political parties and political institutions. According to Berman, the reason why people were joining together in this way is because they couldn't find an appropriate political outlet for themselves in the actual democratic system, right? The parties didn't mean much. And so people began to advocate for themselves within these civil society groups. So you see women coming together, like we saw in that picture with the boats, women coming together in these salons, but also using those organizations as a way to, again, transmit their preferences to the state and in the terms of trying to advocate for their right to vote and other political issues. Now, this seems like it would be good for democracy, right? People participating in civil society, using it for its advocacy purpose, but for Berman, there are a couple of problems with this. One of the first problems is that as serving as a substitute for the formal political system, it doesn't quite end up reciprocally strengthening democracy in Germany. Another problem is that these groups are often very fragmented, right? They only focus on a certain set of issues. So women's groups only focus on women's issues. There were the rise of some nationalist groups that only focused on nationalist German issues. So that created a big problem. for how civil society might translate into the strength of German democracy. The other main problem of the rise in civil society in Weimar Germany is that it made these civic groups really easy to be co-opted by illiberal elements in German society. And in fact, the rise of civil society has, in scholarship at least, been closely tied to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. So, around the early 1920s, when Weimar Germany is kind of just beginning, the Nazi Party is a blip on the radar. They don't have much power in Germany. They, in the 1928 elections that I showed you, got about 2% of the vote. So they're a very small, very insignificant part of German political life. But what the Nazi Party strategized in terms of trying to figure out how they might grow their political base is that they would use civil society organizations, that they would try to infiltrate the robust civil society organizations that existed in Germany at the time in order to spread their message and get a real groundswell of support such that they could get a larger proportion of the vote share. And in fact, what we do see is a strong connection between the density of associations in Germany and how easily parties were able to, or not, how easily the Nazi Party was able to enter the German political space. So where association density was high, indicated by these black dots, we also see that Nazi Party entry began to proceed at a much faster rate than in places where there weren't a lot of associations. And we can see that even more clearly through a correlation plot. So again, where we see high levels of association density, we tend to see that the entry rate of the Nazi Party tends to increase a lot. There's a positive correlation here. And you might say, okay, well, that seems kind of true, but there are a lot of dots here on the lower end of the spectrum, and really this is being driven by all of these kind of outliers here that have high levels of association density and high levels of Nazi entry rate. But that's not true. Even when we control for things that we might think would affect the entry rate, or when we control for these outliers, we still see the same relationship, that there is a positive relationship between how dense associational life was in Germany in any given town, and how easily the Nazi Party was able to infiltrate and gain members within that specific town. And you can't really see it very clearly here. Here's Marburg. And in the Berman piece, she specifically talks about a book that was written about Marburg and how the Nazis specifically targeted that area, targeted groups within Marburg, and eventually grew their political base and what ended up being in 1933 the dominant party in Marburg, Germany. And we can see kind of this rise if we look at the difference in vote share between parties from 1928 to 1932. So again, in 1928, the most popular party was the Social Democratic Party with 29.8% of the votes, and kind of all other parties lagged pretty far behind, with no other party receiving more than 15% of the votes. And here's the Nazi Party here with a meager 2.6% of the votes. But if we look at 1932, what we see is that they've been able in the short span of 4 years to increase their vote share to 37.2% of the vote, making them the highest ranked party in 1932 and giving them effective control over the German state and the German Reichstag. So that is about that's almost a little bit shy of a 35% increase in your vote share over the course of 4 years, simply because of this direct and targeted strategy to infiltrate civil society groups, to spread their message of nationalism, of exclusivism, and of hatred towards the Jewish population in Germany. And coincident with other things that spurred the rise of the Nazi Party, for example, German recession, and things like this, we get a very illiberal government and kind of the destruction of the democratic experiment in Weimar Germany. And all of this, again, happens within a very short time span, about 4 years. So if civil society can be used towards these negative ends, right? If there's kind of a set of civil society that we call uncivil, but definitely does not have a positive relationship towards democracy, and even good groups, right? Groups that are oriented towards positive values can be co-opted by groups with more illiberal values. How do we create a civil society that is actually generative of democracy and democratic ideals? Well, there's a couple of lessons that we can learn from Weimar Germany, and then there's a couple of lessons that we can learn from the other piece that you read about India and civil society groups. So one thing that the case of uncivil society points out is that we should really be looking at the value orientation of these groups, right? We need to look at whether the groups have liberal democratic values, or whether they're exclusivist, whether they're oriented towards hate or other fundamentalism or other forms of illiberalism that we very much would think are unproductive for democracy. By the way, we also might want to look at just what types of groups they are, right? We might think that advocacy groups are really great for promoting democratic skills, while bowling leagues and things like this might not have that same oomph with getting people into the political system. Another thing we might want to focus on that the Berman piece kind of brings up is how are these organizations, well, for lack of a better word, organized, right? Are they organized in a horizontal fashion where we see members as well as leaders being able to equally participate in the organization, gain access to political information, and really gain those political skills? Or is it very hierarchical and segmented, such that we've got more autocratic practices going on within the organization? The more democratic and horizontally structured an organization is, the more likely it is that it's going to be productive for democracy. The more autocratic, which we saw in some cases in Germany, right? These hierarchical organizations that were very much segmented along different lines, the more likely those organizations are to be co-opted by illiberal interests or to be unproductive for democracy. But the thing that our last piece actually highlights, and this is going to be the last real thing that we talk about in the lecture, is what types of communities do our civil society groups bring together? Are these intercommunal groups that try to bridge social divides and have diverse membership? Or are these intracommunal groups that really focus on organizing within a single community and tend to bond people within that single, along a single dimension? So just to give you a couple of definitions, an intercommunal civil society group is one that, again, groups individuals across cleavages or categories of difference. We often think of these as bridging groups. They create social capital and bonds of trust between groups that are different in society. So they're kind of cross-cutting. And as I'll kind of mention later, Varshini thinks that these are the types of groups that we should be aiming for because they're particularly productive of democracy. On the other hand, there are intra-community civil society groups. These group people within a single community, so exclusively women's groups, exclusively, let's say, Hindu groups. So they're really focused on organizing within a single community, and they create not bridging social capital, not the kind that goes between different communities, but rather bonding social capital. They create tighter linkages within a single community. So these tend to be very strong linkages of strong networks of trust, strong networks of reciprocity, but they don't extend across categories of difference. And because of this, Varshini suggests that intercommunal civil society groups are the ones that we need to create the types of democracy and ethnic peace, particularly when we live in segmented societies that may be prone to ethnic conflict. So remember that in the bonus lecture that I did, um, we talked about ethnic conflict and divided societies and how easy it is for societies that have multiple ethnicities to kind of descend into conflict, especially when our political institutions are not properly designed to promote representation. Well, according to Varshni, in these divided societies, what we often see are these kind of shocks that create conflict. Either there can be a political crisis, an economic crisis, some small incidents of violence. And he kind of wants to know, why do we see these things escalate into widespread ethnic violence in certain communities and then kind of diffuse themselves in other communities such that we get kind of long-standing ethnic peace? And according to him, the main difference is how are people bonded within civil society, right? Are they engaging across categories of difference? So are they engaging different ethnic communities, different religious communities, different genders, etc.? Or are they really focused within a single community? Where inter-ethnic engagement is high, he believes that we can get ethnic peace simply because people want to work together. They cooperate to diffuse any tensions. They have strategic incentives for peace. But where inter-ethnic engagement is low, right, where we have only intra-ethnic engagement, then we don't have those same incentives. And people are more likely to believe in rumor mongering and to not trust their neighbors, people across categories of difference. And so we see these kind of violent episodes escalate into widespread ethnic violence. And so he looks at this in the case of India. And India is a very interesting case to look at because, as I showed you in the very first lecture that we ever did together, it has a real legacy of inter-ethnic violence between Hindus and Muslims. But there's extreme variation across the Indian landscape, right? So while a lot of regions in the north of India, particularly, don't see a lot of ethnic violence. There are states like Gujarat, which see very high numbers of ethnic riots between Hindus and Muslims across time. And so what he wants to look at is, why is it the case that we see certain peaceful cities, right, places where there's a spark for ethnic violence, but we don't quite see it really escalate into large riots? And why is it that in other places, like various cities in Gujarat, we see actually these small sparks turn into powder kegs of ethnic violence and riots and death? And he looks at this a lot of different ways, right? He does a pairwise comparison of 3 different cities in India. So some of those cities are from the north and from the south. Like 2 of his pairs have 1 city from the north and 1 city from the south. But what we're going to look at today is actually, I think, one of his best comparisons, which is in the actual state of Gujarat, this actually violent state. There are 2 cities in Gujarat. This is going to take a while to load. It's the perfect time to pause and take notes about what you've learned thus far. Okay, so the 2 cities that we have in Gujarat are Ahmedabad and Surat. And this is a really cool comparison, right? Because one might argue that there are huge differences across Indian states, right? Choosing 1 city from the north and 1 city from the south, that could be very, very difficult to make that comparison. It would be like comparing Massachusetts perhaps to Texas, right? They have very different political systems, very different people rule them, very different historical legacies, etc. So picking these two cities within a single state kind of obviates those problems, right? It has the same governance structure, the same party dominates both areas. Interestingly enough, they have very similar, at least proportions of Muslims in their population. So Ahmedabad has about 13% Muslims, Surat has about 12%. So these are actually perfect cases for comparison. The main difference between the two is that while Ahmedabad is responsible for most of the ethnic violence that is driving Gujarat to be one of the more violent regions in India, right? Surat is actually pretty peaceful. Up until 1992, it didn't really have any ethnic riots. It was considered an oasis of peace in the relatively violent state of Gujarat, whereas Ahmedabad had one of the most deadly ethnic riots back in the 1960s. About 639 Muslims killed in a single day. In this huge riot over the building of a mosque. And so what we have is Gujarat being kind of the picture of violence, tons of Hindu-Muslim violence across the period, especially from 1969 onward into today, and Surat actually having a lot of Hindu-Muslim peace, a lot of Hindu-Muslim interaction. And what Varshni says is the main difference between the two is their legacy of intercommunal relations. So here we are. This is Ahmedabad here, and this is Surat here. And again, I want to emphasize that not only are they in the same state, but they have very similar historical legacies, right? There was Muslim rule in both places around the same time. Both of these places were at one point Muslim dominated cities, but the a central difference between the two historically is that Surat was an important trading port, whereas Ahmedabad was just kind of a commercial city of sorts. And what that meant is that as Surat was a trading port, Hindus and Muslims often had to work together in order to trade textile goods from India to the West, right, to Muslim nations in the West. And trading ports kind of ran through the Middle East, so Muslims had a comparative advantage in linking Hindu traders to important trade networks in the West so they could get their textiles over to the Middle East and on through to England. So there was kind of this reciprocal dependency between Hindu traders and Hindu textile makers rather, and Muslim traders, such that we saw a real robust associational life that grouped both Hindus and Muslims together. So churches, or not churches, sorry, like charity organizations. There these what they called community peace organizations, even labor organizations and business associations tended to grow out of this economic relationship between Hindus and Muslims that was found in Surat. On the other hand, in Ahmedabad, we didn't see this trading relationship, right? Hindus tended to work with Hindus, Muslims worked with Muslims, and they were on different parts of the kind of economic scale. So what we saw then grow in the case of Ahmedabad and Surat is that textile associations, which was one of the biggest forms of civil society in both of these groups, right? Business associations surrounding textiles. In Gujarat, they were homogeneous, right? It was a lot of Hindu business persons and even Hindu workers within singular organizations that really didn't incorporate a lot of Muslims into these organizations. Whereas in Surat, what we saw is an intermingling of both Hindus and Muslims within single factories, within business associations. And so we had these productive inter-ethnic communal relations that eventually lead to the patterns of violence and peace that we see. So whereas when Hindus don't have really working relationships with Muslims, we see small acts of violence really escalate into these major riots because people don't trust each other, because they don't interact, because they don't have these social networks that bond them together. In Gujarat, what we see is, again, that oasis of peace, or sorry, not in Gujarat, in Surat, what we see is that oasis of peace in the state of Gujarat, because groups actively work together to diffuse any incidences of ethnic tension so that they continue to work together economically, right? So they continue to benefit from these productive trade relations that they've had for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Okay, so we're going to end this lecture here. And just to sum up the kind of lessons that we have from civil society, because we're moving to a different topic next week, is that civil society can be very beneficial for democracy. We've seen in the case of Italy, and even in the case of Surat, right, that civil society has the ability to organize citizens and mediate their interests to the state. They can counterbalance state power, and they can socialize citizens into more civic behavior that helps them engage in democracy in a productive way, right? Either they're learning how to interact with others and tolerate people across lines of difference, or they're actually learning actively political skills that help translate into democratic behaviors like voting, political organizing, etc. However, it's questionable whether it's actually causally related to democracy. It's clear that these two things go together, but it's not clear that it's always a one-to-one relationship, that anywhere you have civil society, you're definitely going to have democracy afterward. The reasons for this being that civil society groups themselves can be highly undemocratic in their values and in their goals. So like we see with groups like the Ku Klux Klan, with neo-fascist groups, these groups don't tend to promote the values that we think accord with democracy. And they're often trying to exclude a group of people from the political system or from society, such that it wouldn't promote that kind of polyarchy inclusiveness that we're aiming for. As we saw in the German case, civil society groups can easily be co-opted by the government and by illiberal forces. So when civil society groups are taken over by political parties, and particularly political parties with negative aims, that can be unproductive for democracy. We all know what happened in Germany, so we don't need to rehash that. But obviously, it ended the democratic experiment under the Weimar Republic and led to one of the most devastating episodes of genocide that the world has seen thus far. So obviously not very productive for democracy. And so what we need to do as we're trying to analyze how civil society might relate to democracy, or whether it creates democracy at all, we need to look very deeply at specific organizations. We need to look at their goals. We need to look at their structure. We need to look at their political environment to see whether they're actually going to generate positive effects for democracy, or whether that's going to be more negative. So for next class, we're going to start a new topic, kind of going off of some of the things that we talked about today. We're going to be focusing on ethnic politics and ethnic conflict. And as always, the one thing I ask you to do is to do the readings and watch the lectures. Lecture attendance has gone down, so you definitely want to watch those. I know we switched to pass-fail, but in order to do well in the class, right, even just to pass, you kind of have to pay attention. So please watch the lectures, please do the readings, and please continue to engage with the course either via Slack or via the other fora that we have. Again, I know it's hard. Remote instruction is kind of difficult for everybody, but I miss talking politics with you guys. So please engage in the ways that you can. I'll see you next week. Bye.